Yeah, hello everyone. Welcome to our gathering period for I think the 10th meeting now of the Social Wealth Seminar. So we're here with Philip Rocco, and we'll begin in 2 or 3 minutes, just giving everyone a chance to collect themselves, get into the room, and then we can get started. So Phil, you're in Chicago, right?
I'm in Milwaukee.
Oh, Milwaukee. Oh, that's right. Oh no, I guess I didn't know that. Is Marquette in Milwaukee?
It is. It is
Why
indeed. Right in the heart, West Town.
Oh wow. For my whole life, I just believed for some reason that it was in Chicago.
Oh, that's great. We have another Milwaukee in here. Allah. Excellent. That's great. And where are you? Or where in town are you?
Well, so I live in Crown Heights, though at the moment I'm in Bed-Stuy, so still Central Brooklyn.
And of course, we're expat. You and I are both expat Yinzers.
Oh yeah. That was a fun thing to learn.
Lurking behind every intellectual project is at least one Yinzer.
Yeah. Oh gosh, I was just thinking about Kennywood recently and how it's kind of like an odd year where I don't go to Kennywood at least once. I'm hoping to rectify that next year.
Do I dare ask what the hell a Yinzer is?
Yes, and in your always charming way, Michael.
A colloquial expression for a colloquial person like me.
Do you know what the word yins means, Michael? Have you heard it before?
Yeah. I haven't.
I would request the use of it in a sentence for those natives who are.
Yins are all missing out. That's what I would say.
Yins are all at the Jane Family Institute Social Wealth Seminar.
I don't think I've ever heard anyone actually say it, even if I was familiar with what it entails. But.
Yeah, it's Pittsburgh's local second person plural. It's short for you-ins.
You-ones.
Yeah. Oh, I guess that's a more plausible origin story, huh? For it. You.
Well, there are also people who say yuns rather than yins. My grandmother says yuns, but many different styles.
Indeed. Well, so it's 6:06. We've got a good crew here. Phil, if you're down, maybe we can get started.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's.
Okay, fantastic. Well, welcome everyone to today's meeting of the Jane Family Institute Social Wealth Seminar, which is an ongoing virtual semi-monthly forum exploring strategies to manage public assets and resources in service of a more just society in the US and across the world. Today, we are joined by Phil Rocco, who will be speaking about COVID-19 and the crisis of American federalism. But first, just a couple preliminary words. So as I mentioned, the Social Wealth Seminar is a project of the Jane Family Institute, or JFI. We're an applied research organization in the social sciences with research focuses in digital ethics, higher education finance, and guaranteed income. And for those who don't know me, my name is Paul Katz, and I'm Vice President of Special Projects at JFI, and I help to coordinate the Social Wealth Seminar along with some other projects. So as I mentioned, well, actually during our early preliminary awkward chat period, this is the 10th meeting of the Social Wealth Seminar, which is very exciting. And we'll be having one more after this before we close out the 2020 season. So in 2 weeks, on Tuesday, December 8th, we'll be joined by Sarah Quinn, who's Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Washington. I should just add a quick note before we get started about the format for today's presentation. We'll have about a 30-minute presentation from Phil, followed by lots of time for questions and discussion. So please do save your substantive questions for the end of the presentation. But if you'd like to raise points of clarification, you can do so in the public chat at any point, and Phil can choose to address them or not. I should also note that we'll be recording this session, and we'll be posting a lightly edited version to our YouTube channel for those who can't make it. So if you don't want to appear incidentally, please don't activate your video. All right, so just now to close out with a couple of thanks. As always, I'm so grateful to JFI's editorial department, especially Hala Ahmad, our PR and policy communications lead, and Molly Jektar, our editorial director, who is also hosting today's broadcast of the Social Wealth Seminar from her beautiful Bed-Stuy studio. And finally, of course, huge thanks to Phil and to all of you for joining us today. So a quick introduction to our speaker. Philip Rocco is an assistant professor of political science at Marquette University. Among other things, his work focuses on the political economy of policy expertise, the politics of numbers and quantification, and the evolution of the American federal system. He is the co-author of Obamacare Wars, Federalism, State Politics, and the Affordable Care Act, which was published by the University Press of Kansas in 2016. He is also the co-editor of American Political Development and the Trump Presidency, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press earlier this year. His research has been featured in numerous academic outlets, including, among others, Health Affairs, Publius, the Journal of Federalism, Policy and Society, the Russell Sage Foundation Journal of the Social Sciences, Journal of Health Journal of Health Politics, Policy, and Law. He is currently working on a book manuscript entitled Madison's Engineers: How Policy Science Remade American Federalism, which is under contract with Columbia University Press. So with all of that being said, it's my great pleasure to welcome Phil to the Social Wealth Seminar and to pass the baton to him. Go ahead, Phil.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Paul. And now I'm going to share my screen. This is the real test to see if it all works. And does it? Can you confirm?
I think it does, yes.
Okay, very good. So thank you, Paul, for the invitation again. And thanks for everyone coming out on a late sort of tricky week to come to a talk, but this talk represents some ideas I've been developing in a series of essays and papers over the last few months on the crisis I think American federalism is currently in and what I think we might do to get out of it. So it's very preliminary, some of these ideas, so I look forward to hearing your thoughts ultimately in the Q&A period. Now, I want to begin by just saying, I think there are some people who would challenge the whole premise of this talk, the assertion that American federalism faces a crisis. After all, while the federal government dithered in the early days of COVID-19, governors, that second part of the federal system, took charge, issuing emergency declarations, holding daily press conferences clad in polo shirts, and outlining their strategies for controlling the spread of the virus. Across nearly all 50 states, gubernatorial approval spiked and has remained fairly high. And as the political scientist Kathleen Hall Jamieson put it, a person from Mars observing the rhetoric and actions of our leaders would reasonably assume that Andrew Cuomo is the president. Yet, as cases have skyrocketed, states and cities have faced unprecedented challenges in filling the leadership void left by the feds, that role that they're supposed to play in the federal system. By the summer, states and cities largely relaxed restrictions, which has helped to contribute to the rise in cases and deaths that we're seeing today. Most importantly, those decisions came in the shadow of subnational fiscal crises in which Congress effectively forced the states and cities to choose between protecting public health and protecting their revenues. While projections are somewhat uncertain, it seems likely that revenue losses could top $500 billion in states and cities over the next 3 fiscal years, once we factor in a decline in hospital and higher education fees. This would be an historic decline. And to be clear, we don't even need to do projections because we've already seen effects. As the red line here shows, there's been a steep drop-off in state and local government consumption expenditures and gross investments. And to put this in context, that represents 2/3 of total government purchases. So it vastly outpaces the scale of federal expenditures, which have remained more constant over the last few quarters. It's also worth noting that state and local governments have lost 1.3 million jobs since February, and if this continues, as the Great Recession should have taught us by now, it could dramatically slow the pace of recovery. And I think I hardly need to remind anyone in this audience about the effects these fiscal constraints are already having on states and cities. As some work I've done for the National League of Cities has shown, there's no real safe expenditure category. During the Great Recession, hard-hit towns like Colorado Springs turned off streetlights, shuttered pools and community centers, reduced garbage collections, in the winter of 2016-17, budget cuts left the rather snowy jurisdiction of East Cleveland, Ohio, without a single functioning snowplow. And we could be on the way for a repeat of history. So the focus of my talk today is what can the COVID-19 fiscal crisis tell us about the underlying characteristics of American fiscal federalism, and how might we reverse the dynamics that got us here. And just to preview my argument, I'm going to argue that we need to look beyond fiscal policies themselves and to consider how political structures that define the American federal regime help to lock in this set of dynamics. I'm going to argue that the only way to get out is to reconstruct those elements of the American federal regime. So I'm going to lay out this argument in three parts. I want to talk about how policy instruments make fiscal crises. And then I want to talk about how political structures make policy instruments. And finally, I'm going to highlight some lessons from the past and near-term dilemmas we'll face if we want to reconstruct federalism. And ultimately, I'm going to argue that there's a sort of long-range agenda, and then there's some short-term realities that are going to be very, very different. So I want to begin by pointing out what might be obvious to everyone here, but I think it bears repeating, which is that fiscal crises are not naturally occurring phenomena. They're instead the product of policy instrumentation. They're the product of policy choices. And as background, politics in the United States is commonly described as highly nationalized. We have national politics, national parties, national policies, but revenue and expenditures are not. We rely on the state and local fiscs for a sizable share of government activity. The US is one of the most fiscally decentralized federations in the world, with a very high ratio of own source revenue at the subnational level to general government revenue. It's in the red here in this somewhat unhelpful map from the IMF in terms of its revenue decentralization index. And the thing that I want to note is that pressure on state and local government during crises like this one is intense, not only because their own source revenues are highly pro-cyclical, 48% of those coming at the state level from taxes, which are highly pro-cyclical, but a growing share of expenditures made by states is in the area of public welfare, largely Medicaid, which ideally should expand during crisis, but which is also subject to inflationary pressures. Beyond that, state and local governments lack not only monetary control like subnational governments and other federations, they operate under rather stringent fiscal rules. 44 states require the governor to submit a balanced budget. Most of those requirements are constitutional. 28 states have at least one tax and expenditure limitation, and 40 states place a cap on outstanding authorized debt, which is largely tied to state revenue. So for these reasons, if you're going to see a counter-cyclical response to a crisis like this one, it has got to come at the federal level. And there are obviously a variety of different flavors of fiscal response. Could include a response that focuses on revenues, so providing central government transfers to subnational governments in the form of equalization programs or tax sharing arrangements compensating for lost revenue. It could also include efforts that focus on expenditures. Central government could assume a greater amount of subnational expenditure responsibilities. Imagine if we centralized temporarily or permanently all of Medicaid spending. That would reduce fiscal pressure on state and local governments, would reduce that fiscal crisis. Could also include, of course, as many prior editions of this seminar have noted, debt instruments, so access to COVID-19 credit lines, other forms of debt relief for subnational governments, and perhaps least common, but you see in some other federations, an attempt to relax subnational governments' fiscal rules. This is sort of, I think of this as the backstop. If the federal government fails, this is really what you might hope state and local governments would do, which is relax the borrowing restrictions and balanced budget rules that we see. But of course, many states that would require constitutional action. So there's a high bar there, but it ultimately, in the absence of federal action, might be necessary. And we can categorize all of these responses, I think, in at least one basic way. Are they automatic? That is, do these policies kick into effect when there is a recession or when there's an economic crisis? Do you see automatically a greater amount of revenue being shared with the states, a federal resumption of expenditure activity, formulas changing, or subnational fiscal rules being relaxed? Or are the policies discretionary? In other words, do we rely on Congress, the Fed, some other agency or state and local governments to enact new policy? And when we look at the US fiscal response to the pandemic, we're going to see something here, which is that the response is largely discretionary. And in many ways, fiscally speaking, not that much of the response is actually focused on where the fiscal crisis is going to be, which is in state and local governments. If you look at the 4 packages that Congress passed in the spring, only about 9.7% of allowed legislative spending is targeted on state and local governments as recipients. It's a little bit larger when you look at dispersed or committed spending. And then when you turn to the Fed, only about 6.8% of Federal Reserve lending facilities were targeted on state and local governments. But of course, as we know, and as I'll sadly have to remind us again in a second, the municipal liquidity facility has been designed in a way to prevent it from being used. So less than 2 of the $500 billion that was allotted for that has actually been taken advantage of. And I should say that much of the spending that we do see coming out of Congress is in the form of discretionary programs. It relies on Congress to make the money move and to keep it moving. So we've observed some very, very obvious, I think, deficiencies in the policy instruments, which are contributing to and will sustain, I think, the fiscal crisis in subnational governments. The most important thing about automatic stabilizers is there is no automatic stabilizer program for general revenues at the state and local level. When people point to large dollar amounts for state and local governments, they are not talking about support for general revenues, and certainly not in the form of automatic stabilizers. Even when you look at stabilizers that are automatic, that do exist, like Medicaid and UI, they still rely extensively on state financing. So it's really questionable how automatic those stabilizers can be during an economic crisis. Additionally, both of those programs are notable for having many eligibility restrictions and technical infrastructure problems. 74,000 people in Wisconsin are still in a backlog from UI from the spring. And there are, of course, issues with triggers in these programs, such as the default insured unemployment rate, which is intended to trigger extended benefits for UI. It's known to switch off before long-term unemployment peaks. It's a reality that's, I think, all too familiar for people who are working in state unemployment offices. But I would be very surprised if there's even been a single congressional hearing on this. And that's part of the problem. And when we turn to discretionary programs, it's not actually much better. And I want to focus here on the Coronavirus Relief Fund, which is the largest chunk of the discretionary programs that Congress passed. Provided $150 billion to state and local governments, which expires at the end of the calendar year. Let me repeat that. It expires at the end of the calendar year. This was 31% of the legislative allocation to state and local governments. And the problem with this program is that it is not, among other things, general revenue support. Eligible expenses for the program include grants and short-term loans, hazard pay, UI costs, tech and broadband investments, and a FEMA match. Here's what's not included. Revenue replacement, severance pay, long-term loans, capital costs. And so it's not surprising that when you look at surveys of government finance officers, over 70% of them say the main problem with the CRF are the restrictions on its use. I'll just give you one example. In Pennsylvania, in sort of unprecedented bipartisan agreement between the governor and the state legislature to use $300 million of these CRF funds to help school districts at a time when local revenue losses and cost increases for things like cyber, charter school tuition are very steep. The Treasury forbade Pennsylvania from using that, which means that there's about $200 million that school districts in Pennsylvania are still scratching their head about. Additionally, these funds are highly contingent on gubernatorial and legislative action. which can be a problem in part-time legislatures or legislatures that think they're more part-time than they are, like Wisconsin's, which for the record has not been in session since April. So when we turn to the Fed, we also see evidence of a similar pattern of incremental discretionary action at best. We know that the terms of the MLF were set in a way that priced out 97% of eligible entities, meaning that less than $2 billion of the 500 went out to help cities. The person who's running MLF, Ken Heitschuh, has basically said that he won't step in to replace private lenders. Federal Reserve Chair Powell has not used Section 14.2 authority to make swap lines available. This is all going to be sort of a rehash for people who have been to this seminar. But the point here is that when you put all of these policy choices together, the federal fiscal response was indeed unprecedented, but of course so was COVID-19. But even so, the fiscal programs, both the discretionary and automatic ones, failed to recognize the role of state and local government finances in the economy, the fact that state and local governments contribute about $1 trillion every year to GDP. So there's a huge subnational fiscal crisis that is just not addressing. Compare it, just for an example, to Germany, where feds and the Länder are going to cover 100% of municipal business tax losses, take on a permanently higher share of federal support for municipal welfare payments, and suspend, I think just temporarily for the moment, balanced budget rules at the municipal level, which would seem to be a far more proportionate response to the pressure that's being put on municipalities in Germany. When you compare just the scale of government employment in the United States, we don't have a proportionate response. And the reason for that is the policy instruments that we're using to deal with this. Now, this example of Germany versus the United States, I think helps to point up what I think is the sort of core message of this talk, which is that to understand why policy instruments look the way they do, we need to more carefully analyze the political structures in federal systems that shape policy instruments for intergovernmental fiscal relations. But one thing we can say for sure is that the subnational fiscal crisis isn't a partisan matter. This is from some work I've done for the National League of Cities, shows that the probability of subnational and revenue and expenditure declines during the Great Recession is essentially equal at all levels of partisan control. So it really doesn't matter which party is controlling the state of the city. Your probability of experiencing a fiscal crisis is about the same. Yet that partisan divide is essentially the message that's coming out of Washington. That's the debate that we're having. We're having it in the context of a partisan ideological struggle. Do we have too much spending or too little spending? And it's of course being framed as a sort of red state, blue state issue. Proposals for state and local aid are being described as a bailout rather than a measure that will help to enable state and local governments to undertake their constitutional responsibilities under federalism. So the question a comparativist here might ask is, why are these very territorial issues about functional responsibilities playing out in largely nationalized partisan terms? Now, I don't think that you can attribute this just to the issue of polarization, which is a sort of catch-all explanation, unfortunately, in sort of nonfiction discourse at this point. I would argue instead, if you look comparatively, it's because we have no institutions to formally coordinate the territorial dimension of public policy. And the way that I want to think about this is, in federal systems, there's a lot of variation in the mechanisms that countries employ to coordinate the preferences and needs of territorial and central governments. These range, and I have a little sort of schema here, they range from really formal institutions like second chambers like the Senate or the Bundesrat in Germany, to very, very informal mechanisms like bilateral ad hoc meetings between different levels of government. So what I want to do here is look a little bit at how each of these mechanisms works in federal systems and with explicit reference to the US, okay? So we'll start with the sort of most formal one, which is second chambers, the Senate. And these exist in most federal systems. They're putatively supposed to be the formal arena for territorial representation. Yet there's something that federalism scholars call Madison's paradox, which is second chambers are usually constitutionalized to represent territorial interests, but they almost never do that. The lone exception is in Germany, where for some reason the Länder are actually functionally represented in the Bundesrat, but that is really the exception to the rule. So really, as soon as these things are constitutionalized, you begin to see alternatives to bicameralism, other structures that are meant to do the same thing. That's probably because of joint decision traps to some extent, and the fact that it's very hard to coordinate preferences between local territorial governments in a sort of legislative setting. But by the 20th century, it's pretty much the case that these chambers aren't playing that role, again, with the exception of Germany. So far more important internationally in federations is the sort of concept of executive federalism or intergovernmental councils that work to coordinate policy among levels in a federation, discourage the idea of taking policy unilaterally, or most importantly, ignoring the territorial implications of federal fiscal policies. And so if you look at most federations have things like this, First Ministers' conferences in Canada, the Council of Australian Governments. So there's a number of these organizations. Incidentally, we used to have something somewhat like this in the United States called the Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations, or the ACIR, but it was disbanded by Congress in 1996, and I'll say a little bit more about that in a second. So, when the rubber meets the road, what do these intergovernmental councils do? Well, I'll just note that during COVID-19, Australia has created a sort of new intergovernmental architecture. There's a new national cabinet that's explicitly made up of representatives of state governments that is designed to actually tee up and execute fiscal reforms. In Canada, there's been an explicit, what's called an FPT, Federal Provincial Territorial Collaboration, that developed what's called the Safe Restart Agreement, which created broad-based intergovernmental support in 7 areas. So it wasn't just like the CARES Act, where it's sort of targeted towards this emergency relief. It was comprehensive and sort of spread across 7 different sort of functional areas, included general sort of general fiscal reform. Again, things aren't perfect in Canada fiscally. There's some serious challenges ahead, but there's a framework to take territorial interests into consideration when making those choices. And that's really the difference here. And there's some other examples of this as well. But the thing to note is that major fiscal policy changes in these federations are coordinated explicitly through intergovernmental councils. Now, really interestingly, the ACIR, when it existed in the United States, if it were to exist now, it would be playing that role. It was established in 1959 by a really large bipartisan coalition. It was the only part of American government that included formally representation from all 3 levels of government, at the local level, counties, cities, other kinds of jurisdictions as well. And it coalesced a sort of core of intergovernmental expertise. It produced routine sort of information about the effects of federal policies on states and cities. It also was able to do legislative agenda setting because it had the capacity to draft new legislation. So essentially, as new issues emerged, the commission would draft legislation. So it's really responsible for the fact that we had general revenue sharing in the 70s and 80s. It was also responsible for a number of other policy ideas at both the state and local level in terms of grants management and sort of fiscal federalism. It was disbanded in 1996, really as the result of a 2 decades long austerity war in which a variety of consultative and expert bodies in the federal government were disbanded. So you really have deficit vultures to thank for this. And so what remains after the ACR's demise is another kind of mechanism for intergovernmental coordination, the White House Office of Intergovernmental Affairs. But don't be fooled by its name. It is not a brokerage mechanism. Essentially, it's a political agitprop office that builds the president's reputation in and among state and local officials. So as one former IGA liaison at this office said, when you're at the WHOIA, you are an advocate for the president's positions, right? So it doesn't really follow that same schema. So what are state and local governments to do? Well, they are to apparently behave like any other special interest group in society and lobby Congress. The only problem with that, as this graph shows, is that intergovernmental lobbying is now dwarfed by other sectors. State and local governments now compete on a terrain with many, many other powerful stakeholders. In the first quarter of 2020, when many of these important issues were being debated, lobbying expenditures by the pharmaceutical industry were 5 times higher than that of civil servants and public officials. They didn't rank even among the top 10 industries in terms of lobbying expenditure. And for their part, national associations of state and local officials have done vigorous work in intergovernmental lobbying, but coordinating their action across groups can be difficult. And this is sort of one thing I've been looking at, is when do these organizations issue joint statements, and it can be something that's very, very difficult to coordinate, especially in very compressed legislative timelines with centralized bargaining between 2 parties. It is not the kind of environment that advantages traditional intergovernmental lobbying. Now, of course, Congress isn't the only venue where these things play out. There's also been bilateralism, but it's not, I think, terribly effective. And the Trump quote here is pretty illustrative of why it's sometimes not effective. Now, governors, of course, reportedly enjoyed a far warmer reception from the Vice President Mike Pence than they had from other White House staff, whom one state official referred to as, quote, the fucking worst. But the Vice President was often unable to broker the conflicts that invariably emerged between the President and the governors. Often in these 35 phone calls that Vice President Pence had between January and September, he lacked the authority to actually take action on things that were bargained in the meetings, telling governors instead that he would, quote, look into it. So when you don't have authority, and when the person that you were in fact bargaining on behalf of doesn't really have consistent preferences, bilateral negotiations are going to be pretty ineffective. So taken together then, what we see across these 5 different mechanisms is there are major institutional gaps in the capacity of subnational governments to inform and to shape policy choices that will affect them and could lead to or stave off local fiscal crises. So there are major gaps in this institutional landscape for coordination. And so what I want to deal with here is what can we learn from the past about how we might reconstruct this system so that we don't get the same sorts of policy instruments that lead us to the fiscal crisis that we're in. And I want to say sort of 2 sets of things. The first is some lessons we can learn about sort of what I would regard as long-range plans for rethinking fiscal federalism, as well as some more brutal, I think, realities about what state and local government's options are in the near term, assuming nothing good happens. So at the very least, I think there's some indications that President-elect Biden has started his transition with at least a nod to rectifying state and local fiscal situations. His speech at the National League of Cities Summit last week is some indication of this. But even if this reaches the top of Biden's agenda, I think challenges will remain, partly because of the national political landscape, but also partly because of some of the policy orientations that we're potentially going to see within his administration. One challenge that we can learn about from the past is, however, that failing to represent territorial interests as such, right, failing to actually talk about the subnational fiscal crisis in terms of state and local government's ability to fulfill their constitutional responsibilities, means that this issue, however important it is just going to be framed in ideological or programmatic terms of too much spending or too little. Intergovernmental councils and other federations can actually show us how having an agency of government that's explicitly devoted to the territorial dimension of public policy can disrupt that ideological boundary work. and I think can highlight the connection between the fiscal policy and subnational functional responsibilities. And there's even evidence of this within American history, not too long ago. In 1967, the Advisory Commission on Intergovernmental Relations released a report called Fiscal Balance of the American Federal System, which included in it a huge proposal for general revenue sharing. But the way that the report was framed was in terms of the fiscal needs the states and cities had in order to fulfill their constitutional responsibilities in the federal system. So I think it's possible that President-elect Biden could, at minimum, recognize this and reorganize the White House Office of Intergovernmental Affairs, not as an office to primarily promote his own reputation, but as a site of brokerage for state and local officials to begin to plan and help the administration process intergovernmental issues in territorial terms. Even if this is not something that he wants to do and wants to maintain that, a temporary commission like the predecessor to the ACIR, the Kestenbaum Commission, might be one example that he could do of this. But there's an important caveat here too, which is that one-off reforms of fiscal federalism typically fail. They typically fail because, unfortunately, no one cares about fiscal federalism. It doesn't have a very broad natural political constituency. One reason why these reforms really often fail is they're rarely tied to broad popular demands. And I think that you can imagine a world in which fiscal federalism reform could be tied to broad popular demands. For example, taking expenditure pressure off of state governments by creating Medicare for all, removing the necessity for state governments to pay for Medicaid, which is a substantial chunk of their budgets. Making sure that the benefits of major reform of fiscal federalism are visible in the near term can invert some of the problems that are typically seen here. General revenue sharing is one example of this. In fact, the way that the program was framed, it had very clear payoffs in the near term. And there was, if you can believe it, a quasi-grassroots campaign that barnstormed in favor of general revenue sharing. I've seen in Indiana, of all places, in an archive, bumper stickers for general revenue sharing. And that is just a bizarre thing in American political history, but it could happen if you frame the issues in the right way. Otherwise, these issues, these reforms tend to fall flat. So it could be possible that a reformed WHOIA could generate a long-range vision for reforms that would free up fiscal space for state and local governments and connect to popular demands. Now, I am not bullish on either of these ideas coming to fruition in the near term. And I'm not bullish for three major reasons. The first is that, of course, there's likely to be divided government in Washington and an enduring partisan divide on the question of state and local aid. I don't see that necessarily going away anytime soon. I also think if you look at the Biden transition team, there's not a lot of what I would call intergovernmental expertise. Of 550 members, 3% are from local governments and 10% from state governments. And now they're asking for crowdfunding, although I'm not sure. I guess they're now transitioning the GSA. I wrote this talk yesterday, as you can tell. But I think this is a huge opportunity for Big Seven organizations to play a role in providing capacity and expertise that the Biden administration doesn't currently have. But I don't think that lobbying alone is going to break the stalemate. And I think that intergovernmental lobbying, as we've seen, in this very crowded environment, it struggles sometimes to find a voice. And that's why I think we ultimately need structural reforms to incorporate state and local governments into the normal clockwork of American public policy making. But what I would submit is that in the near term, assuming that these dynamics of legislation don't change, that subnational governments' leverage exists not from lobbying, but as a byproduct of their decisions to protect public health. Consider, for example, that the main reason, I think, for Congress's passage of the CARES Act was not the spread of the virus itself, nor lobbyist pressure alone, but significant fluctuations in the real economy and the stock market resulting directly from state and local public health regulations. This is just the number of states with statewide stay-at-home orders by day in those months, and the number of total confirmed cases. The result of those actions was a sudden and massive reduction in the output of goods and services, causing a massive dip in consumer activity, which I think has a lot to do with why Congress responded when and how it did. By the time the next major package was on the table, the virus was continuing to spread, but states were already relaxing those initial orders and the economy had picked up. Some of the pressure had been taken off. Now, as of today, state restrictions are in a sort of situation of flux. They appear to be weaker right now than they were in March, despite the broader spread. There are few general business restrictions like we saw in March. There are only 7 states, the last I counted, with full in-person restaurant closures. And I think there's the residual sort of lingering of this logic that we have to avoid the worst case fiscal scenario by keeping our regulations lax. But what this has done is it's further enabled congressional intransigence. And I think that it might be possible, even if a small number of populous states were to take stronger public health ordinances, as we might see, I hope that we see, that it could change the environment in which Congress finds itself. Now, there are, of course, important commitment problems that local and state governments have, especially given local backlash to these orders or simple non-adherence to these orders. I think I've seen in some jurisdictions in Illinois, sheriffs simply saying that they're not going to enforce any of the orders, which creates a commitment problem, which makes this whole mechanism difficult to leverage. But if a sufficient number of states are on board, those problems may not be fully insurmountable. But the bottom line here is, and I'm not sure that this is an especially optimistic conclusion, which is that until the federal architecture gives state and local governments the voice they deserve, they're going to have to use whatever sources of agenda-setting power they have to change the scope of conflict. In other words, in the absence of strong coordination mechanisms, the only way to compel Congress to perform its role in the federal system, which is to provide economic relief to fiscally constrained state and local governments, is for state and local governments to do their role. In other words, the role of protecting residents from the spread of this virus. Whether or not they can, I think, will determine the shape of the fiscal relief that we're going to see in the next few months. So I will leave it there.
Well, thank you so much, Phil. What a fantastic presentation. Both for the breadth and I think depth of the coverage, but also I don't know. I for one really appreciated your framing of kind of territoriality and partisanship. Why are these territorial issues ultimately expressed in partisan terms, which I just found extremely helpful and a very fresh take on this question. So thank you so much for this really excellent presentation. I'm sure that many present will have questions and comments. As always, if you'd like to ask a question, please just indicate in the chat that you have one, and I can call on you, and you can unmute yourself, and if you are comfortable, turn on your camera, introduce yourself to the group, and pose the question directly. But if you'd prefer to remain anonymous and not appear at all in the recording, you can just type your question in its entirety into the chat, and just let us know you'd like to be anonymous, and we can read it. Please do jump in with your questions. I've been, talking quite a bit as always, so I'd love to yield to anyone who wants to jump in at this point. But unless a name appears in the chat in the next couple seconds, I'll start us off. Okay, I'll just do it. A question. I have several that I was noting as you were speaking, Phil, but one that I want to ask first is about the kind of role for the Federal Reserve in all of this. It's I imagine for the reasons that you've cited, very hard for anyone here to call the municipal liquidity facility a success. And of course, it looks like it's on its way out with Trump. So I guess I wonder, I mean, do you see, in terms of what could be realistically achievable in the near term, a role for, perhaps a better designed facility, emerging in its stead? What might be the best thing to hope for?
Yeah, I think, look, it is not merely the possibility of a better designed facility, but a different usage of the Fed's powers here, right? I mean, there could be swap lines, there could be, there are a variety of potential tools the Fed has at its disposal. But, and this is where my knowledge of the sort of inner life of the Fed is lacking, is I have not seen any indication that there is sufficient sort of will to use the power that the Fed has. And I think if you look at the decisions that Ken Heitschuh has made, I think that is, at least with MLF, is very contingent on who is in charge of that facility. And it's not surprising that not wanting to crowd out the municipal bond market is, one thing that's animating it. But, I don't necessarily see, and it could just be because I don't know where to look as an empiricist, where that sort of pressure comes from within the reserve. But I do think if you look at other central banks, there's a very sort of different approach to this kind of policy making. And I think, it's, to me, it doesn't seem like the mere absence of congressional action thus far has been enough for the Fed to engage in more than merely very bounded innovation. I think it might take a stronger and sharper shock to get the Fed moving if Congress doesn't.
Great. Well, I see there's a hand up here in the participants list from Amanda. I'm going to assume, Amanda, that is an indication you've got a question.
Yeah, I did. Hey.
Hey, Amanda.
I don't have my video. So I wanted to talk about the MLF a little bit more, and I'm curious of what the broader vision is for what the Federal Reserve could do for fiscal policy. Because it seems like a fundamental limitation of the MLF, or it's going to be fundamentally limited if it's a short-term debt program, right? Like if governments have to pay the debt back in 3 years, and we're seeing that the impacts of COVID are hitting their budgets in 2021 to a greater extent than 2020, like how useful is a short-term debt program? And then two, how useful is it when the private debt, like the municipal bond market right now is highly active and new debt issuance has been at record highs, right? So if most governments can access debt right now, what do we need out of the MLF, or out of the MLF, or a completely different Federal Reserve program?
Yeah, so I mean, I agree with you. The sort of activity in the municipal bond market is, certainly picked up significantly since August, right? But I think the real, question is, how effective are those instruments going to be in filling some of these gaps, and what is the what on what terms are they being offered, right? And I think that's the real that to me was kind of one of the real lessons from the Great Recession. It would seem that the terms on which municipal debt is being offered are not necessarily always the most agreeable ones. So I think, when we think about Fed policy, it is at this point, to me, something that I've seen really as a possibility in the shadow of congressional inaction, but certainly when it comes to the sort of job losses. If you think about one of the Fed's goals as being sort of employment policy, there are, I would imagine, sort of other levers that could be pulled there. But I think the fact that we're looking at the Fed, to me, is one sort of illustration of the sort of fact that we don't have really solid mechanisms to coordinate policymaking between state and local governments and Congress. I mean, so now we're sort of looking for any instrument that we can find, and I think also like the range of options are not even necessarily defined, because in terms of state and local government's ability to have a formal sort of seat at the table, there's not a sort of clear institutional channel there as well. So hopefully that answered your question. But I mean, I take your point on the short-term nature of the instruments. I think it makes a lot of sense.
Great. Well, I believe we have a question now from Steve Waldman. Steve, would you like to ask it?
Sure. Hi. So first, thanks for a marvelous talk. Very provocative. A lot to think about there. I wanted to ask, back during the financial crisis, we in the United States were fairly smug, at least, about a few things, and one of them was that Europe was having such a harder time. And we would sort of mock them a little bit because they had this agency problem where the Southern European countries would be, the screws would be turned on them, and their leaders, rather than rallying in some straightforward way on behalf of their own publics, seemed to be, sort of culturally and careeristically more aligned with the center, with a kind of EU elite. And at least some of us sort of on the left kind of interpreted that as basically, well, these sort of elite government figures were basically selling out their populations. And it seems to me, listening to your talk and thinking about some of the events of the COVID experience and the Obamacare experience, to what degree is it that we no longer sort of lack institutions to work out territorial issues? And to what degree is it that somehow sociologically we've created a kind of analogous agency problem, where when their referenda Medicaid expansion passes, but the political leadership of the state, if they're Republican, says no, and we wonder now, well, why on earth isn't every state leader, crying out, every mayor, every governor crying out for Congress to fill in these revenue gaps, but clearly they aren't, and I wonder if maybe it's less a coordination problem and more a kind of agency problem. So that was my comment, and to ask for your thoughts on that.
That is an excellent, comparison, I think, to make, because the situations of state and local governments here are not fully analogous, but analogous enough where you don't have to force the comparison too much. It makes a lot of sense, right? And I do think, and there's some good research on this, and there's a lot more research, I think, yet to be done on this agency problem. But I would point you to the work, for example, of Jake Grumbach at the University of Washington, who has really tracked the sort of change in state and local government cadres over time. And I think, and this analysis comes through in other works, Don Kettle's book on federalism as well, is sort of a big part of his story, is that sort of as parties and party cadres sort of nationalize, and I would argue also as they sort of get divested of local organizations and neoliberalize, the understanding of what the role of state and local governments before the center, right, as claimants on the center really does change. And I think you can see that kind of even before Medicaid expansion. I think you can see that, trying to think when I would point the first sort of instance of that. I mean, there is, in the 1980s and early 1990s, some talk about shifting off responsibilities and sort of trading off Medicaid to the federal government in exchange for the states resuming more welfare. I think that, to me, was sort of the last time where you see these people acting even remotely as agents of their state as some sort of functional entity. But I do think there's something to the claim that the institutional field of state and local government has to some extent changed, not universally, but that the intergovernmental organizations no longer have a sort of monopoly on voice. They no longer are the sole organizations that speak for the state and local governments, although I think they still want to be that and want to articulate that. And so, yeah, that is actually a very viable sort of ding, I think, to the argument that I'm making. Although I wonder if it's possible to deal with the coordination problem as a way of perhaps providing some alternative frameworks in which to think about agency. The Medicaid expansion is an interesting one, because the question is, who is the agent? Now, initially, there was a lot of consternation and obstruction sort of across the board in so-called red states. But the most interesting dynamic I've seen with Medicaid expansion is the slow trickle of Republican states into the pool of states that have expanded Medicaid. Now, it hasn't happened because of the beneficence of governors, though there's some early implications of sort of gubernatorial leadership, Ohio, Arizona. But I think it's also the result of popular movements. Idaho being, to me, the best example of this. If you saw what happened there with the Reclaim Idaho coalition, and took policy to being like a 60% vote, I think, in the end. Of course, it's nice to have the ability to do an initiative and referendum. But I think what you're suggesting maybe is that in addition to thinking about the challenges of not having this coordinative infrastructure, it's the fact that if you don't have an ability for people to exercise voice popularly at the subnational level, those agency problems are still going to remain, most likely. Does that answer your question? I mean, that's a really fascinating thing. Great to engage.
No, that was a wonderful response. Lots more meat in there than was presaged by my question. So thank you very much. It's a great talk.
Thanks for the question. It was great.
And actually, it's a fantastic bridge, I think, to the question that will round us out today from Danielle. Would you like to ask your question, Danielle?
Hi, thank you. Yes, what you just were talking about getting popular support behind the program. I'm very interested in how we move this actually from the grassroots level. So please, could you say more about the general revenue sharing campaign in Indiana and how people were having bumper stickers about this? Because here in Florida, we got Amendment 4 passed, which has been very problematic since, but it was 64% of the voters passed it. And so if people can get excited about general revenue sharing, I'd love to know how that happened. Thanks.
I feel like this is an Amanda Cass project as well. How do you get people excited about revenue sharing, changing revenue sharing policy? Let me give you like the Reader's Digest version of general revenue sharing. So this is something that Congress was debating in the early 70s. Nixon administration was on board with it. Some urban Democrats were on board with it. But it faced a classic problem that exists in congressional lawmaking, which is, okay, so you're going to say that a general part of the federal fisc is going to just automatically go to state and local governments, which means that members of Congress can't claim credit when the benefits are delivered. This is often described as something that's a barrier to anything like automatic stabilizers. So what happened was really fascinating, was you had the National League of Cities, the US Conference of Mayors, National Governors Association, and several other intergovernmental organizations actually were able to trace out what the effects of revenue sharing would be on a variety of other concerns that were sort of pregnant at the time. It became seen as, in part there were sort of social policy implications, like here are the things the city could do to fix X or Y problem. You ended up seeing both business and labor sort of getting involved in sort of promoting this. And it was sort of like a snowball thing. It became seen as something that was consistent with just good government, right, at the time. And I will actually see if I can, if you want to email me, I will share with you there's now the archive that I was looking at has been digitized, and is the archives of the former mayors of Indianapolis, Richard Lugar in particular, and his papers on this actually have the literal bumper. You can get the digital version of the bumper sticker if you want to screen print it. Yeah, but I think the point is that you have to, in something like this, you have to solve that, not just the sort of like the agency problem of getting governors and mayors to like want this thing, but also the problem of members of Congress need to see that there is some concrete credit that they can claim for doing it, right? And that I think is, a challenge. I mean, and that's a challenge. It's really not even ideological. It's just purely about the sort of electoral motivations of members of Congress. Thank you. It's a good question. Thanks for letting me spin a yarn.
Well, goodness, I mean, thank you so much, Phil, for this really spectacular presentation and excellent discussion. I am, so impressed that you've turned, for one thing, general revenue sharing into like the new social justice crusade, which I'm very impressed by, and also just to, again kind of framing what I think sometimes get falsely reduced to being kind of very dry and arcane questions to I think the kind of vital political issues that they in fact represent. So thank you again for joining us today. Just to say in closing that we will be back for our last session of 2020 in 2 weeks on Tuesday, December 8th at 6 p.m. Eastern. When we'll be joined by Sarah Quinn, Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Washington. So hopefully we'll see many of you back then. But for the moment, just to say once more, thank you, Phil. And it's really been our pleasure. And I hope you have an excellent evening.
Thank you very much, Paul. Appreciate it.
Well,
thanks, everybody.
Well, good night.